Okay, we're ready to begin our afternoon sessions, and for this session, Sara Roszak will be doing the moderation, and the title of this session is Current Efforts to Predict, Prevent, and Respond to Medical Product Shortages During Disasters. We have another very nice collection of folks here representing feds, industry, and a variety of interests. So Sara will have fun, I think, with this. And so, Sara, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Thanks for the introduction. I'm glad to be here and participating as a moderator on this panel. And before I go ahead and introduce the folks, I just wanted to let you know about my role at my organization and what we do. So I'm Senior Director of Research Programs at the National Association of Chain Drug Stores. And NACDS represents drugstores across the country. This includes companies with 4 or more stores, traditional drugstores, grocery stores with pharmacies, and mass merchants with pharmacies. So pharmacies that are on the smaller side all the way up to national and international chains with thousands of stores. And we've been deeply engaged in preparedness and response efforts for years, and excited to hear from the panel and learn more about what they're all doing related to drug shortage efforts. I also wanted to reflect on the panels from this morning and the spirit of public-private partnerships. I think that will be a great theme that we can continue through this panel as well, since we have a lot of really diverse perspectives. So I'll go ahead and introduce everyone briefly. I know you have the full bio list that was outside of the door if you want to read more about them, and then we'll jump right in. So today, and I'll be going from left to right from your view, we have Keegan Lenahan, Associate Commissioner of Strategic Initiatives at the FDA. We have Mary Kosinski, Chief of Staff and Deputy Vice President of Science and Regulatory Advocacy at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America Association. Then we have Carla Miller, Vice President of Pharmacy Services and Clinical Therapeutics within the Clinical Services Group at the Hospital Corporation of America. Patrick Byrne, Logistics Management Specialist at the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, within HHS. And then Francois Solans, Chairman of the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineering Drug Shortages Committee, and he's also with Johnson & Johnson, but today his remarks will be on behalf of ISP. So with that, I will turn it over to Keegan, and we will have each of the panelists first provide a brief overview on their agency's role in prediction, prevention, and response related to medical product shortages during disasters, giving us a sense of what their current efforts are, gaps, and challenges with the current system.
Thank you. I just want to start by thanking our colleagues at ASPR and for the National Academies for partnering with them on this workshop today. Very helpful, and certainly helpful in FDA's kind of cross work on this as well. I think I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what you've heard a little bit here about the new drug force task force that FDA has launched, an interagency workshop, and how we can kind of partner with ASPR and the National Academies with this workshop to make sure that that work is also incorporated in whatever we send back to Congress. You heard a lot from my colleague this morning, Dr. Throckmorton, on what the FDA has been doing since kind of the spike in drug shortages around 2011, 2012, and the additional authorities that FDAs gave FDA and how the increased communication has helped us avert hundreds of potential shortages over the last few years. That being said, obviously shortages are still a problem, which is why we're here today. And, you know, as evidence, we had 150 members of Congress send a letter to the commissioner this summer asking us to, applauding FDA's work in this space, but asking us to look at drug shortages from a new lens and find potential solutions that maybe are outside of FDA's specific scope. So we have pulled together, the commissioner announced, as Doug mentioned earlier, this is extremely important to the commissioner. He has definitely taken this on and wants to take this on head on. He has asked me to lead this task force and get some outside of FDA partners in this space to work with us on potential solutions, things that we wouldn't normally think about with our FDA lens. And so we've asked the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, and CMS to come to the table with us to be a part of the task force to look at some potential new solutions dealing within their space that maybe we don't normally look at. And being that they care for and treat tens of millions of Americans, they look at this from a different lens than the FDA would look at that. So the task force has a really great opportunity to look at underlying systemic forces from the procurement of raw materials all the way to patient delivery that lead to some of these shortage things. It asks different kinds of questions than FDA normally looks at. Incentives in drug supply chain. Why is there limited competition in certain markets? Why is it hard for a manufacturer to get in a certain market? Are there ways to make that easier? Are there government regulations that might impede some of that, or are there things that lead to shortages in that space that we need to be studying? What roles does consolidation, I think the first panel mentioned this earlier, what roles in consolidation in the market, in the drug supply chain have we seen that might have increased the idea of shortages in this space? What are the factors that limit or encourage capacity building to ensure adequate manufacturing? So these are, I think in the very near future we'll be talking about this kind of in a more public space, but I feel like these are some of the questions that FDA normally doesn't ask. And certainly when I look at also, are there additional authorities that FDA could take on from Congress or through regulatory authority that we could be more helpful in this space? FDA has many different work streams and efforts when it comes to drug shortages. And I feel like many of you in this room have partnered with us in the past on quality, safety, supply chain, prevention, communications, response, and disaster. Our hope is to continue that partnership and just looking at it in a different way to make sure that we're capturing as much as we can. And certainly hoping to incorporate everything that's learned from this event today. Since the Commissioner's announcement in July, there's been a lot of outside interest and actually internal USG interest in engaging with us in this new endeavor. So very shortly here, you will be seeing a docket that will have an opportunity for folks to publicly engage with the FDA on specific, there's a laundry list of questions that you'll see soon on the kinds of things that we're looking for answers to. With that docket will also be a notice for a public meeting. And so we'll be holding a public meeting in the fall of this year. The docket will be open through the end of the year, and then we'll hold a public meeting in the fall and invite experts and industries in this space to come talk about some of the challenges that they see and some of the potential solutions to routine or classic shortages. And then lastly, we'll be holding a series of listening sessions. I think a lot of you, I've actually talked to a bunch of you here today that have been invited to these listening sessions. And so we're hoping that the conversation around those listening sessions are very similar to what you see in the docket. So those are the kind of questions that we hope the folks come to the table, and it's really, whether it's providers or manufacturers or experts, academics, it's a whole host of folks that have reached out that are interested in kind of sharing their space and the interest of just people's time and space at the FDA. That we could only hold so many, which is why they've kind of limited, but we're trying to do 8 or 9 folks in each session, and those sessions will be held in September and October. And with that, I'll yield back, but we look forward to working with you all on this endeavor going forward and making sure that we're capturing everything we possibly can to get a very robust report back to Congress with legislative and regulatory solutions by the end of 2019.
Great, thanks Keegan. Mary?
Thanks, Sarah. So pharma represents the country's leading innovative biopharmaceutical research companies, which are devoted to discovering and developing medicines that enable patients to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives. Since 2000, pharma member companies have invested more than $600 billion in this new search for treatments and cures, including an estimated $71.4 billion last year alone. Recognizing that communications are critical in disaster preparedness and response, following Hurricane Katrina, pharma, along with our sister industry associations, including Sarah and her colleagues at the National Association of Chain Drugstores, established RX Response. now known as Healthcare Ready, as a platform to convene across the medical supply chain, touching beyond our membership of pharmaceutical manufacturers through distributors and the pharmacies where patients pick up their medicines. Coordinating through the ecosystem and knowing where and when access issues are taking place in a disaster is not easy. Clearly and effectively relaying information about drug shortages in an emergency is paramount. Pharma member companies work closely with the FDA every day, and in response, the ability to centrally communicate with the front lines gives us all a better position to support patients. Understanding that medical product shortage management in a disaster builds upon relationships fostered through these routine interactions, pharma appreciates the opportunity to engage in these strategic dialogues about how to communicate and coordinate response efforts. We'll continue to partner with our federal colleagues and the medical supply chain ecosystem and appreciate this workshop is a component of that strategic discussion set. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Great, thank you. Carla?
Thank you, Sarah. I just wanted to start with a little bit about HCA. HCA Healthcare is 178 hospitals across the U.S. and London. We are in 20 states. We have 1,800 sites of care, ambulatory surgery centers, freestanding EDs, urgent cares, and we also have about 29 million patient encounters a year. So from a HCA corporate perspective, obviously our role is to really support our facilities in ensuring that the patients get the treatment that they need. The drug shortages are interesting. I'm going to specifically talk about in disaster times, what are some of the things we're doing. And as I was reflecting on what do we do during a disaster differently than we do during just day-to-day shortages, I really only came up with one area. So what I'm going to talk about also encompasses how we manage shortages. I think my colleague from Cleveland Clinic said earlier, fellow pharmacist, he said, really shortages are disasters, and I really think that that's a really important point. We recently were having discussions about the IV opioid crisis and had communicated about perhaps opening our emergency operations center because of the criticality. But day to day, we do active monitoring and surveillance. That's one of our, for all medically necessary products, including drugs. We monitor that from a day-to-day basis, even when there's not a disaster going on. So we know when we're getting at those critical low areas. When we get at the critical low areas, that's when we really move into the clinical utilization. So from a clinical utilization perspective, we spend a lot of our time looking at what's the appropriate use, is there any overuse that we can decrease so we can reserve product. We have a robust supply chain in the organization. So we have central distribution centers where we can easily move product between those distribution centers. An example of this in action would be during the Las Vegas shooting. So our large facility in Las Vegas was one of the primary hospitals during the shooting that was receiving patients in. Obviously, there was a lot going on. They didn't know exactly what was happening at first. What was also happening in the background was this critical IV shortage. During a trauma like this, you're going through a lot of IV fluids. So what the organization was able to do within 40 minutes of the first gunshot, my colleague in the room, Michael Wargo, who's the Vice President of Emergency Preparedness for HCA, was able to get the Emergency Operations Center running. This provides 24/7 support for our hospitals and our divisions. And we were able to get product moved quickly from our other hospitals to the site that was taking care of these patients. And then the trickle-down effect of that is then we have to move product from other markets to those hospitals, moving product to the main hospital where the trauma is going on in order to make sure all patients are being cared for. And then quickly assessing the entire company. Interestingly, during this time, we're partnering with a large multidisciplinary team to say, okay, we've exhausted a lot of saline in the organization. Let's really look at our utilization patterns, and is there anything we can do to really get to the physician to say, hey, are you sure that you need this second bag, the second liter of normal saline? So we developed some clinical decision support at the point of order entry, especially in our emergency departments. It's actually well received. What we found was while we felt like the IV shortage was nationally known, our physicians that were caring for the patients at the bedside, many of them didn't know at what level of criticality it was. So just that communication was a key in that area. And back to that emergency operations center, that probably is our main difference during a disaster versus managing day-to-day shortages, is how do we communicate quickly, and the emergency operations center is really one of the hallmark ways. I think one of, and the Las Vegas shooting is an example of this, one of the challenging areas are the unknown unknowns. So backing up, what are our known unknowns? Hurricanes. We've got one out in the Atlantic Ocean right now we're watching closely. You have known unknowns. We don't know where it's going to hit. We don't know what the impact is going to be. But we do know in time, hurricane season, that there is a plan in place that we're able to move product, that we're able to ensure that those facilities in the paths of hurricanes have enough product to get them through for a certain period of time. The unknown unknowns, where you have these unexpected conditions, is what really pose the biggest risk. And how do you respond to a situation where you have no way of planning for that? So our key is through communication and support, but it is our biggest risk area.
Great, Patrick.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I work in BART as a logistics management specialist. BART is a division within ASPR, but I think you probably already know all that. ASPR's mission is to save lives and protect Americans from 21st century health threats. BARTA's mission is to develop medical countermeasures, things that don't exist. So those things as drugs, biologics, and medical devices for threats that are of national security interest. Pandemic influenza, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and emerging infectious diseases. Those are the things that we focus on. My role as a logistics management specialist is to assist the BARTA project officers think through some of the logistics issues. I'm not talking about what you need to do to get from point A to point B. Those are more administrative kinds of things. I'm talking about supply chain, transportation, maintenance, services, those kinds of things that affect basically a new product introduction in order to make it effective. The aim here is to incorporate these considerations into contracts that then lend themselves for a transition to the strategic national stockpile and ultimately to support preparedness response. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some observations from the 2009 H1N1. It was brought up because there's a lot of little points there that we can learn from. And specifically in the use of vaccine administration devices, aka needles and syringes. And then leave you with some points to consider from my perspective for preparedness response when it comes down to planning. That's what it really comes down to. So BARTA's focus during the pandemic was on diagnostics capabilities, it was on antivirals, and naturally it's going to be focused on vaccines, the king of battle for that particular requirement. But in the months following the declaration, we were also tasked to provide needles and syringes that would then support a vaccine administration along with the vaccines themselves. So to accomplish that, because normally we get into things that don't exist, this is a commercial item, we first had to understand the vaccine requirement. And then we had to understand what products are associated with those, with that vaccine requirement that were necessary to satisfy that. So in this case, the requirement for a pandemic vaccine was to make vaccines available for basically all U.S. citizens. So that equates to 600 million units, because when you talk about pandemic, you're talking about a 2-dose regimen, and that's the planning factors that we play with. So 600 million is a huge number. Okay, it's almost unmanageable. And then you got to consider what do you need. So you can't just use any needle and syringe. And as I was digging deeper into this whole industry for needles and syringes, it's actually a pretty wide field. There's a lot of needle and syringes that have a lot of different applications. So you would think that maybe not be a problem, but the truth is when you narrow that down to what we need, they had to be FDA approved, they had to be NIOSH certified as safety engineered on either the needle side or the syringe side. They had to be a hypodermic needle, 1 inch or 1.5 inch, not or, but and. They also had to be 23 gauge and 25 gauge, and you had to have a syringe that had to be 1 ml, 3 ml. So when you take all that, you basically look at this industry that has a lot, and you start to narrow it down to some significant few. So what could be hundreds now ends up to being maybe about 30 or 40 items in the marketplace. So that changes the dynamics of things, especially when you have such a high number. So with that, then we have to take a look at, okay, who makes this, okay, and how much can they make, and what capacity they have, and when can they deliver it, and all those other kinds of questions, the obvious questions that at the federal level we would take a look at for these commercial items. So we were lucky in that there was a market survey that was done in 2007 that pointed out that there were 2 companies that we had reached out to, and those 2 companies said, yep, they did have the capacity to basically take care of this requirement. Because that was done in 2007, we had a little bit of time in the May-June timeframe in 2009. We updated that survey, found 2 additional companies, and reconfirmed that the requirement could be met, at that time in the world. So we then proceeded to develop acquisition plans and then go through contractings to take care of things. And then prosecute the war to make sure that you had a needle for every vaccine that was coming out on the vaccine side of the house. You want to make sure you have both, otherwise you really don't have capabilities and you introduce other problems along those lines. So you think prosecute campaign, job's done, we can all go home, everything's good. If we left it at that, then maybe that would be true. But the truth is there were little things, little signals and little clues that as time went on that started to make sense when you start looking at them. So that's what I want to talk now. One of the things we found out is that because we had to do all this planning in the middle of this response that's starting from April to basically September, is we didn't have contracts for these devices. We had to create them. So that's acquisition lead time. Acquisition lead times basically equals lost opportunity in the market when you start looking at manufacturers. They're making this stuff available all across the world. Okay, so you don't want to lose that. Of course, when you do have that and you bring them on, well, then you want them to ramp up with a lot. They have to make up a lot of ground. That becomes problems for them as well. So that's something that we've learned from that. Since 2013, we've put contracts in place with manufacturers that represent the market, not just for 1 or 2 items, but representative of the products in the market. And we're in the process now of updating that for the next several years going down the road. But there's some other little points that may be disparate, but they all point to some of the things as to why I'm going to talk about this stuff. Between 2000 and 2008, the availability of seasonal influenza vaccines was growing steadily. In 2008, that number looked to be about 80 million doses. Okay, so that's good. That tells me that there's a number there that we have that represents what the market can bear, on top of normal healthcare demands. So that's a number we look at. My requirement is 600 million. So the question you have to ask is, all right, maybe we need to do some digger deeping, some deep dives into this whole process. Can you really get there? Well, the truth is we really didn't find out because in that September timeframe, clinical studies basically said 1 dose was good. So my 600 become 300 million. That becomes a little bit more manageable in the scheme of things, and we proceeded to move on. But you have to do some more digging in this process. The other thing is that despite contracts coming in late in the game, I believe they came in the July-August timeframe, manufacturers were able to contribute up to 80 million units for the start of a campaign. That's pretty significant when you think about it. So that led me to believe that there was capacity in the market in 2009, okay, because they did it. They went basically from 0 to 80 million almost overnight. If you ask the question today of those vaccine manufacturers, they would tell me that don't count it anymore. Okay, it's not possible. So that's a planning factor that we have to consider is that if we're going to start from something and it's no notice, there's a long lead time to get these things up and running. So that is an implied shortage already that you have to account for in planning. The other thing is that, which is a good news story, is that 80 million in 2008 as far as availability of vaccines for seasonal, became 140 million in the last several years. It's roughly leveling off there. So that shows that people are taking their vaccines, which is a good thing. It also indicates that the manufacturing capacity that used to be there in 2009 is no longer available. Okay, it's one of those indicators. So one more thing down that we have to think about as we do these things. The other thing is that as you look at that, needles and syringes are used in normal day-to-day healthcare. So there's a steady state that manufacturers plan for, and they will run the production lines for those hypodermic needles as well as every other needle and syringe that's available. And they look at the seasonal requirements as being something that's additive to what they have to do. They have to plan for that over months. Okay, so they can actually have the stockpiles ready in the August timeframe and then make that available just as the supply for vaccine becomes available and then it gets distributed and then you have a campaign. That's all a planned activity. Okay, so that tells me that now we're talking about capacity that's basically very narrow. And it's also tells me that manufacturing capacity isn't really idle either. Okay, it's constantly running. If it's not doing one thing, it's going to do something else. And if it stops, it's only going to stop because there's a maintenance requirement that you have to meet, get it moving, and then you keep on going. So the opportunity to surge essentially has dwindled from 2009 to where we are today. You know, essentially what I'm hearing from manufacturers is that we are at capacity. So plan that when you need, plan for that when you have to do your planning for any kind of contingency. The final observation I'd like to make is that in the focus of pandemic response, you can get tunnel vision really, really easy. The focus is on the pandemic response at the detriment to everything else that's associated with healthcare. So that didn't become apparent to us, except for a little couple of things down the road many, many years later that says, I still have all this other stuff to do that's impacting healthcare. By focusing strictly on a pandemic or whatever situation you want to call for, that introduces potential shortages as well. Okay, so when we do our market surveys going forward, rather than asking questions, can you meet the requirement, we're starting to look at that and saying, can you meet the requirement given healthcare, normal healthcare demands? If we don't know that, then the assumption is it's available for a response. If we do know that, then we can at least account for that in our planning. That's an important takeaway. So the points that I want to make in this process, looking at it from BARDA as a developer, and the things that we normally engage in, the subject matter expert we have, the projects officers we have, will normally be in bed with these developers on everything you can think of, on the manufacturing, on the clinical side, the regulatory side, all that stuff for these things for which there is really no market space. They understand that business. That same level of detail, that same level of information doesn't really exist for things that are already in the commercial marketplace. To some degree, we have to figure it out, okay? And that's a shortage, that's a shortfall. The requirement for needles and syringes may have just never been figured out, okay? It may have just gone under the cover, maybe not even looked at as a potential requirement for, as a shortage item that we need to plan for. So my point here is that there are things that the BARDA can do, there are things that ASPR can do in dealing with how do you deal with a response for all these threats that we have to deal with, that also have to engage the rest of HHS, that also has to engage the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, all those other activities, all with their own authorities, that take a look at knowing how manufacturing works and what the limitations are, what authorities can be put in play to address some of these issues. I think we can do some work in that area. At the same time, we are at the mercy for information, okay, is really what it comes down to. We need, and I'm glad that we had these discussions with the manufacturing community. It was quite open and frank discussions because you have to have that so you can do the appropriate planning that can then lead to a good response plan that can go down the road and not impact things in the last tactical miles where it really counts, because that's where the rubber meets the road. So my hope in this 2-day workshop is that we continue to have more frank discussions with manufacturers on specifically these commercial items. Maybe not necessarily in the BARDA venue, but definitely within the HHS venue, so that so we can figure out what we don't know, we can figure out what we need to accommodate and to make allowances for, and then find the right solutions that are viable within the federal government and also support what basically the private sector needs. So that public and private communication has got to be there. Otherwise, basically, we're going to be operating in a blind, and then we're just going to take whatever we just have to deal with whatever's next.
Thank you. And Francois?
Okay, I'm here representing ISPE, and maybe some of you wonder what is ISPE. It's the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineering, and we count more than 20,000 members around the globe, individual members, pharmacists, engineers, bioengineers, and we serve them in providing guidances, education, and raising constantly the bar when it comes to technology, manufacturing, quality, compliance, and different domains. And ISP started working on the drug shortages in 2012. I joined the team in 2012 as a chair of this endeavor and this task force. And we started small. We started with just a concept paper at the time. We brainstormed and looked at the problem of drug shortages. And we came with some ideas that we shared with FDA at the time, with Janet Woodcock and the team. And we presented the concept paper. But rapidly, the first question came is, we don't know what we don't know about shortages. We need more information. You have 20,000 members around the globe. Can you survey those members? Can you get some meaningful information from this membership on what the causes of shortages are? Because we wanted to talk from facts and not talking from our own perspective of few individuals in a room. So we started this endeavor in end of 2012 with 20 members of ISPE and built a survey, trying to get through a big questionnaire and with some methodology and getting through our members. And Janet Woodcock at the time asked us to accelerate the program because we wanted to provide the information by the end of 2013, which is a normal time frame for this type of survey to happen. And she asked us to bring the results by May 2013. So we took this challenge and we delivered. And we came with quite a number of insights around different dimensions, not only the ones that we knew already that were public knowledge at the time. Quality was really a big problem of shortages. Generic and sterile injectables. We talked extensively this morning about the continuous problem around parenterals. But also some other dimensions on what is the corporate culture behind this. Is the corporate culture facilitating shortages to happen or preventing shortages to happen? What are the practices in the company? So we had a number of elements popping up at the time through the survey, and we published the report of the survey. I encourage you to go to if you have not done it yet, to go to the ISP website and to download a number of documents that are available for all of you. The survey is one of them, and I will talk about a couple of others. It will give you some insight of what we've done for more than a decade. And from this survey, we felt that we had to deliver something more to our members, to authorities, not only FDA, but to authorities around the globe, because we are broad-based. And we wanted to have a meaningful approach to the problem. So we attacked this by analyzing the outcome of the survey and build a drug shortage prevention plan, because all the intent was to aggregate this big knowledge and provide it to our membership. So we started building a very comprehensive report, which, again, I engage you to download and to read. It's more than 100 pages, so you have the full weekend reading covered for free. I have a paper copy here because I'm a very old-fashioned guy, so I have not the electronic version, but I have it always with me as a chair of the committee, and it's full of information on the different dimensions of the drug shortages and how prevention can occur in different dimensions around technical, manufacturing, quality, and compliance. So this drug shortage prevention plan, we started producing the document in 2013, and we articulated this document around 6 major dimensions. The first one was the corporate culture, because the tone at the top is essential. Is the C-suite in your company caring about preventing shortages? Do you have processes in place? Do you have resources to take care about shortages? Do you set the tone, because quality was one of the big problems? Do you set the right tone at the top, saying that there will be no compromise to quality and you will do everything possible to prevent or to alleviate quality problems that may occur? So we worked on this dimension, We worked also on the second dimension, which was building robust quality systems. It seems so obvious, but it's so fundamental. And we talk about what to do at the time of crisis and emergency, but a lot of what you do at the time of crisis and emergency resides in strong foundation you build at steady state. And over these 2 days, I encourage you to think about how to build the right foundation that will continue to be robust and resilient at the time of emergency, or at least will create a very solid foundation and a very solid base to respond to the emergency. So, robust quality system, we had to re-explain what the expectations were from all regulation around the globe. We have roughly the same GMPs, we have different spices and different approaches and interpretations, but the fundamentals are the very same. And we reproduced here a number of the expectations, asking our members and industry to look at this and to create the right space and the right oversight with a quality system. The third dimension we had to work on was metrics, because it's good to have a quality system, it's good to have the right corporate culture, but if you don't measure, if you don't know what's going on, not only in your facility or your offices, but across the network, you don't know what happens, and you cannot manage appropriately. We have very complex supply chains. It's not anymore one facility producing for one single market, having the sources and suppliers just around the facility. This time is gone. We have an ecosystem of very complex supply chains that come from Asia, Southeast Asia, US, go back to Europe, and the product ends up in one of the markets. It's extremely complex. We were talking this morning about different suppliers having the capacity to produce, but one single supplier was the cause of the problem because he was the only one, the sole supply for one raw material. We have to analyze our supply chain in depth, and we have to measure this supply chain regularly. And we spend quite some time in the drug shortage prevention plan talking about meaningful metrics that companies should consider, should have, in order to measure, prepare, and prevent shortage to happen. The other dimension is building a continuity planning, and this one is very important, not only at steady state, but also in time of emergency. And I will go deeper as we progress in this panel. But I think the key of the business continuity planning is to look at 3 key dimensions, and we talked about this morning. It's about building robust network, robust operation. It's about building robust quality system as well. The second dimension is about redundancy. We were talking about redundancy, and it's not economically affordable to duplicate everything in your complex supply chain. But you need to understand where the weak points are and do a very thorough analysis to understand that either a material, a supplier, because of poor quality or sole source of supply, will become a potential problem. And you have to start making your prevention planning and preparing different scenarios. Scenarios could be around building inventory, building capacity, an extra shift, building extra resources, having another plant or another line producing and readily available. One of the elements you have to do is to understand how long it will take to have the production available, because you can reserve capacity at a supplier and you can pay for it. But at the time of crisis, you want the product immediately. If you don't have the supplier approved, if you have not done the technical transfer of your product, if you have not done the all approvals and transferred the materials to this supplier, there is no way you can activate this supplier in a short time frame. We did a study, a brief study at ASPE on the time it takes between the technical transfer of a molecule or a product to a supplier and the full approval in all the markets. And everybody was shocked when we published the numbers, but it takes 7 years, 5 to 7 years, to get the product approved from the second source of supply in all the markets in the world. In one single market, and we were looking at FDA with accelerated approval can take 2 years, but we look at global markets and potential impact on the patients worldwide. So it takes a lot of time, which means it takes a lot of resources to plan upfront and to be ready. So business continuity planning for me is paramount. Second, source of supply is very important. You have to define where to apply, where are your weak points, and it requires an in-depth analysis. And it's not the last one. The last one is resilience, which to me is the most important dimension of business continuity planning. It's about scenario planning. When you know the robustness of your supply chain, when you know where you want to create redundancy, etc., you have to create scenarios for kind of what-if plans. What if we have a hurricane? What if we have an earthquake? What if the two happen at the same time, which happened last year? And those what-if scenarios will help the management of the company defining where you put your bets, where you put your investment. Do you want to invest on a second line, on a second eventually plant, which costs a fortune? And is it viable economically? Do you invest in inventory in order to prevent the shortages to happen? And this mechanism of the business continuity planning, if it's well applied, well understood, can prevent some shortages to happen, can prevent some crises to happen, at least can create the ground for an accelerated recovery. So we have spent a lot of time defining those elements. I encourage you to have the full reading because I give you just a glimpse with my French accent, so I'm sorry. And the two other dimensions of the drug shortage prevention plans were around communication with authorities. We discussed pretty extensively the importance of transparency, rapid information to authorities, telling them something could happen. And time to time, we have to recognize that companies don't know what they don't know. They have a problem. They inform authorities, and potentially in 6 months, something will happen, a shortage will happen. And they don't know at this stage if they will have a remediation, if they have even a solution. But the sooner you inform the authorities, the sooner you work hand in hand with the drug shortage group of FDA, for example, the sooner you can get rid of the problem and the sooner you can find solutions. Many of the members, many of the companies were reporting to us that this relationship has been very, very strong at the time of crisis for the resolution, and we encourage all our members to communicate openly and rapidly and transparently with authorities, not only FDA, but authorities around the globe. And last but not least, a dimension we don't talk very often about is capabilities, because we found that there is also the need for knowledgeable capabilities in your plants, in your facilities. You need, if you do just an extra shift, for example, you need the extra knowledge of the shift for sterile injectable. Those people are trained for 6 months, a year, just to do basic stuff. Eye professionals are trained for 5, 7, 8 years. You don't get this knowledge in a snap. You need to prepare for it. Building those capabilities proactively comes from your BCP, your business continuity planning assessment, but you need to build the capabilities in order to respond appropriately to steady state and to crisis, to emergencies. So these are the 6 dimensions. I try to make a long story short, but these are the 6 dimensions we worked on in this drug shortage prevention plan. And this was done in 2014. We said, it's not enough. We need to explain to industry how to use it and go from theory, which is this nice book, to practice. How do we go for practice? And we started building a gap assessment tool in 2015 and published it at the end of 2015. And the tool is with a questionnaire and desire states around those 6 dimensions, explaining that's what you should do in 1-2 pages. That's the expectation here. It's corporate culture. That's what we mean here. That's what you need to think about. And with over 200 questions around the gap assessment tool, we try to help our members and industry as well, and the companies, to do their own assessment. And conducting this assessment is not a yes or no, it is a maturity model. You need to know where you are. Do you have state-of-the-art procedures, playbook when it comes to business continuity planning, for example? Have you assessed already your supply chain? Do you know your supply chain? Because it's so complex that time to time, some people know a little bit of it or just a portion, but don't have a holistic view on the entire supply chain. So it starts from knowledge of what you have to do, and then what tools, what elements do you have in place, and if some are missing, you have an opportunity when it's still steady and you don't have a shortage yet to bring this tool to life so you will prevent better shortages to come. So this tool has been developed in 2015, and we have also presented the tool in conferences and published it and make it available. The tool is not available to the public, it's available to our members, but it's available to members and all regulators. And if you want to have access to the tool, for some of you, please contact ISP regulatory, and they will try to make it available for yourself because it's so important for this workshop. But I encourage also to look at this tool and what has been published by ISP, because it's good elements of building a prevention and proactive plan towards preventing shortages. We didn't stop there, because we found that having a tool and having a book is not sufficient. You need to train, you need to educate. And we went to build a webinar the next year, which was 2016. And the webinar is pretty comprehensive, takes the best of the drug shortage prevention plan dimensions and brings the elements of the GAP tool and how it should be assessed. What should you do if you are in a small company and you don't have the infrastructure of big companies? You want to learn from the best, but you don't want to have all this big infrastructure. And you can learn from the webinar, use the GAP tool, listen and read the drug shortage prevention plan, just to do a baseline. I don't consider this as a panacea, quite frankly. But the work we have done at ISP is providing a basic tool to our members to assess, to reflect, and to think upfront in order to prepare the best prevention plan. And the same year, in 2016, it's a long story, I'm a bit sorry for that. In 2016, we decided to recognize the companies of the year, because we had a Company of the Year award for technical aspects, which we call FOIA, and we recognize the best companies when it comes to innovation, when it comes to bringing the best of manufacturing or quality and compliance to life. And we started recognizing and creating an award for drug shortage prevention or remediation. And we started recognizing company at that time. And last but not least, in 2017, we looked at other dimensions, because we were concentrating on technical aspects, we were concentrating on quality and compliance aspects, which are big, quite frankly. But we wanted to extend the research, and we did a research with Pew Charitable Trust and looked at the dynamics existing in the United States of America only. We didn't look holistically, United States, for sterile injectables. And we looked at all other dimensions beyond the quality dimensions. We found quite a number of elements and dynamics there, and this is also available on the ISP website, so I encourage you to have this reading. It's extra elements of causes of shortages and what companies are doing, with some examples of what they were reporting to us to do. And what we are considering now is continuing this endeavor, because we are still highly committed to help resolving this issue, and we want to thank the committee for inviting ISPE to the workshop, and so pleased to share what we are doing and learn from all what you're saying. And this year we want to develop an app to make our tool more available, friendly, and more used, by the way, by our members and by industry. So that's where we are. We are still strongly committed after 7 years of effort, and this relentless effort will continue, I'm sure, until the problem is completely solved, and because patients are waiting.
Great, thank you, Francois and the panel, for those opening remarks. I wanted to build off of some of those initial remarks and go back to the concept of data and decision points and metrics that Francois was mentioning. And maybe we can start this question with Carla, and then if others want to chime in as well, that would be great. So I know there are a lot of decision points as you think through drug shortage issues during disasters. Perhaps you could share more about what information you need to support decision making as you look to prevent, predict, and respond to shortages during disasters, perhaps from the Las Vegas example or others that you might want to share.
Absolutely. And first you have to know, one, is there a current shortage going on, and what does that look like? What shortages are impacting, and then what does your inventory look like, and where is that inventory? How quickly can you mobilize it? You know, during our hurricanes, last year was obviously a bad year, but I'll specifically talk about Houston, Hurricane Harvey. You knew it was hitting the Corpus area, so that was the first phase. So we were mobilized to get drug to Corpus after that had happened. What we didn't know was that Houston was going to be hit as hard as it was with the rain post. But luckily, we had brought drug to San Antonio, to Austin, Dallas, so that it was nearby, knowing that it was, and as it continued, making sure that those areas were well supplied with those medically necessary, not only drugs, but supplies as well. So I think the key is knowing where your inventory is, knowing how much you have on hand, knowing how much you're going to need, monitoring the utilization. And it was interesting in Houston. One of the areas where we had not planned for was many of the community pharmacies were unable to get people into the pharmacy to open the pharmacies, the outpatient pharmacies. And we do not have outpatient pharmacies in Houston. So we also served as an outpatient pharmacy for those patients that needed outpatient medically necessary drugs, such as their insulin, their anticoagulants. And that was something that we had to mobilize the outpatient drugs that we normally don't have in hand in order to meet the needs. And I guess we also partnered with our organizations to see, as soon as those outpatient pharmacies were opening in the area, thanks to the resources that you guys have put together, as soon as they were together, ensuring that we get patients to the right place to get the drugs they needed. But just an example of some of the data elements that you really have to be monitoring. And then we were in constant communication with our wholesaler multiple times a day, also finding out what they're able to get to our distribution centers, what we're able to get in. So it's constant communication and knowing where product is at all time.
Great. Others interested to weigh in on that one?
I would just add a remark to this. And as ASP, we worked on both steady state and local SWOT emergencies when we were looking at, especially at business continuity planning, as I mentioned. But listening to the different panels, I think there is, through the last year experience, an enormous knowledge that has been developed across the different institutions, across the different companies as well, hospital system. And we have really to harvest all these elements we've learned in a playbook, because if we don't, I fear that we will lose track of this, people will change, and we will reinvent the wheel at the next emergency. And I think a part of our task is to find maybe this magic wand or magic bullet that will help us to resolve the crisis, but essentially we will have to repeat a number of simple things we've done and we've learned during this last year crisis. And we need to put this in a comprehensive playbook, because it's not a magical element. It's really a number of things we've learned from a patient standpoint, from employee standpoint, community standpoint. Do we have fuel? Do we have generators? Do we have generator for our own employees? Some basic elements so basic as, do they have money to purchase food? Do they have food and access to food? Those elements are part of the big playbook we have to probably build, and harvesting this knowledge from all of us here in the room and beyond this room is an essential task we have to take for the next year and a half, so it doesn't fall apart and it's not lost forever. And at the time of the next crisis, we will build on superb knowledge. So that's something I'm pleased to be part of.
Great. And so I have one more question, but if folks in the audience have a question, if you would like to start making your way toward the microphones in the back aisles, please feel free to do so. So I wanted to ask about how you communicate with others in the system, other players in the system, and how you engage in public-private partnerships, either in predicting, preventing, or responding to disasters. And perhaps Mary might want to start, and then we can move on to others who may have an interest to share.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So Sarah has teed it up nicely because Healthcare Ready was incubated as RX Response following Hurricane Katrina by a number of trade associations because we recognized that this was an ecosystem-wide conversation. And so it wasn't about each individual manufacturer, each individual distributor, but it was about the totality of how product moved through the system to our patients and how we got information from the field. So I know that Nicolette's going to moderate panel 4 and she's going to troubleshoot a little bit about those gaps and how we exchange that information, but acknowledging it's that beauty of a public-private partnership that isn't just the day-to-day communications with the Food and Drug Administration on issues that affect each company, but how we look at the overall space that benefits the patients.
Keegan?
Happy to jump in. You know, FDA has mapping capabilities, so before the storm actually hits or a disaster happens, if that's what it is, we can have some conversations with firms beforehand that their products might be at risk and have a good understanding of what kind of contingency plans do they have. Do they have backup capabilities? Are they moving their product off, like in Hurricane Maria, are they moving their product off the island so that we can get it out of the way so that we can still have access to it? And then working with others that maybe don't have the backup plans in place to ensure that there's an expedited approval review of a new facility to get them back online, to make sure that the product is still being made somewhere. So I feel like there are different avenues that FDA can use to have pre-conversations with firms, and then also after the disaster happens, how do we get you back online and back producing so that you can be contributing to the supply chain?
Okay, it looks like we have a question in the audience, so please state your name and organization.
Hi, I'm Steve Krug. I'm a pediatric emergency physician at Leary Children's Hospital of Chicago. First of all, thank you for this amazing discussion. This was worth the price of admission. I don't think there was a price of admission, but anyway, you said some very important things that really need to be applied across the board, not just to medical product shortages. First of all, you'll never improve something that you can't measure. We need metrics. I think that's been said by at least maybe all 3 panels at this point. And the complexity, if we just focus on medical products, medical countermeasures, the complexity of the supply chain, I've learned more about that today. I already thought I knew something about that. Really is going to require us to think through this thoughtfully and think through this as a true private partner consortium, because the feds can't make this happen and the private sector can't make this happen alone either. We really have to work at this together. This same issue regarding continuity of operations and surge capacity versus surge capabilities, also vital, not just in medical product shortages, but actually in day-to-day healthcare. And what's different about healthcare today is we all know that things get really tough during a pandemic or a disaster, but those situations are simulated from time to time during normal daily operations because your emergency department's overcrowded, your EMS system is overburdened, you don't have any ICU beds, there's no pick a medication or vaccine that you ordinarily use. And so we're constantly being tested to be prepared for this on a day-to-day basis. It's really become part of normal operations. I guess the question I would have for you guys are 2 things. One, how do we collectively move towards identifying metrics, because that might make our jobs a lot easier? And secondly, thoughts about how we can get all the stakeholders working together on the concept of continuity of operations and also on how do we become more resilient.
I'll start. Yeah, I think one of the fundamental questions we have, or actually one of the fundamental gaps we have, is a lack of information. So just by having dialogue, we can figure out what the right questions need to be. And the other point, and again, that's us with manufacturers, us with all other aspects of the healthcare system. The other thing is you can't treat the supply chain as an independent, as a separate element all by itself. It's actually a system of systems, and one affects the other, and the other affects everything. So basically, it's a symbiotic relationship. So we have to look at the supply chain as part of the overall healthcare system and ask questions from that perspective. So the questions we can dig deep into the supply chain piece of it, that is oriented on supply, but really it's you have to look at those kinds of questions in relationship to everything else that we have. Otherwise, all we're doing is moving deck chairs on the Titanic, and that's not going to help anything. So it has to start with discussion.
Adding a little bit on your questions around metrics, I think we have a number of metrics already existing, and yes, we have to develop much more, but there is an element behind the metrics of transparency and information. In this world of big data, real-world evidence, we need also to think about the use of technology for getting the data to all of us in this ecosystem. As you mentioned, the measurements are very complex because of the nature of our supply chains. They are extremely complex. If you go from a real end-to-end, from the first primer raw material to the end product at this distribution through the different channels, it's extremely complex. One metric will not make it. So you need to have a set of metrics, but you need to have also a very different analysis and data available, which today we don't have. We have very fragmented data across the system, and we need to think collectively on how can we make this data available, number one, how can we use this data in meaningful ways to generate insights, because we can have massive data but no insight at all, and no action from those insights. So we have to work collectively on defining that.
One kind of piece from the FDA perspective, just as an example of this, is as far as a metric and information and transparency. We have these mapping capabilities. We understand what firms make what products, but we're not exactly sure if that firm is actually making that product at that approved facility and how much product they're actually making. So, and while we get reports of that annually, if there was real time to understand the amount that was being produced at a certain entity, I think we'd be much better suited to understand what we'd lose should we lose that facility.
Can I ask a quick follow-on to that? What is the barrier to getting that information for what you would lose? Like, as we envision sort of a dynamic IT analytics, machine learning process, is it access to data? Is it different formats? Like, what's the barrier to being able to access that information more real time?
I'll use as an example, and Keegan, jump in with this. From in thinking about the initiative the FDA started several years ago, the Sentinel Initiative, I think some of the learnings, and HCA is a data partner with FDA on this, is the data differs greatly between whether we're talking about payers, whether we're talking about providers. I'm sure it's true on the manufacturer side. There's very different pulling that data together. And the Sentinel framework is a very sophisticated undertaking. It was a large group of people, a sophisticated system to bring data in to be able to query the data and come back out with an answer. And I've been into some conversations regarding, is there an opportunity to leverage the Sentinel infrastructure for drug shortages, since you do have a basis there. But going back to some of the barriers, I think it is the data quality, how you pull the data in, how do you put it in a transparent manner, but also not put anyone at risk, put it in a safe environment where it can't be segregated out. So I believe we've got some frameworks out there that we can build off of, but it is complex.
I would say, just to add that, information sharing too, right? Some of these are business decisions on what lines they want to run and what facilities. And if they want to share that or not share that, it's proprietary and theirs to do that with. So, Congress could mandate them to do that. That's not what we're saying they should do. It's just, if there's a way to get more information about those specific things, I think it would give us a little bit more of an idea of what's actually happening in that space.
My name is Sheldon Jacobson. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Illinois, and I work in optimization and artificial intelligence, so I certainly appreciate much of the discussion. As a follow-up to the previous gentleman's question about metrics, I mean, the scientific method requires that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. However, in this particular case, there are multiple stakeholders with multiple objectives, which means it's not a very simple decision problem because of these multiple criteria. Given that fact, there is no best solution. In spite of that, a solution is needed. I'd appreciate comments on how those trade-offs are resolved.
I mean, maybe you start by going back to Pat's original point is stakeholders need to sit down at the table and have a real discussion about what are the risks here, how do we want to come together, what is everybody's stake in this game, and what are the potential solutions that people would be comfortable with doing. And I don't think you can have that with one-off conversations. I think everyone has to be seated at the table. And I feel like these kind of forums are a good opportunity to see some of that partnership because there is a lot across the board. But certainly there are still problems and how we get everyone to the table to decide this is as far as I can take this or this is where I'm willing to go. I think those are the conversations that need to happen.
Just adding a little bit to this, there are for sure the metrics measuring the totality of the chain or the ecosystems are difficult to put together. But there are, if you look at the different segments of this ecosystem, there are attempts and there are good metrics also existing to measure the health of the system. And I know FDA is working with industry on a set of metrics to address the quality dimensions and the GMP dimensions. Companies have also metrics when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to measuring their inventory, because inventory is all about cash flow, and all companies are measuring their own cash flow, so they have very good and accurate metrics there. There are a number of elements existing. The way we link them doesn't exist, and that's where we have to place extra efforts to make them more comprehensive.
Hi, Louis Rubinson. I'm at the University of Maryland, and I'm an adult ICU doc and a hospital executive. Thank you so much for your guys' great conversation. I guess without boiling the ocean, how do we have high-level discussions that can actually prioritize when certain drugs are in short supply? So yesterday I had to make a decision about IV Benadryl. To me, that shortage wasn't as worrisome as some of the issues we've had on IV opiates, especially for my complex operations around people getting heart transplants, et cetera. So how do we actually make it where the drug matters, and when there's not good substitutes, and when there are key elements that cannot be easily exchanged, that we move that up to the high level of the list, rather than just it's another drug shortage and the list of names continues to go on? Where does that conversation happen so that we understand actually the impact at the end user? Where again, a lot of times we're able to substitute very easily one antibiotic for another. You know, it's a headache for our electronic health record order system, but on the most part, it's very easy for us to do that. There are certain drugs that if we don't have, can actually have catastrophic impact. And I'm trying to understand how that bidirectional conversation happens so that we buttress those elements when they start getting in short supply. The second part of that is, where do we marry the supply chain with the mitigation strategies for how to use drugs? Every institution, so we have 5,700 different hospitals in the country. We're all doing it independently. When we have to figure out shortages, we're all spending our FTE time of figuring out what we're going to do to be able to substitute, rather than having a central clearinghouse to give guidance on how might we be able to use other drugs in a smart way. So can we create a community of folks that are trying to respond, rather than individual hospitals and systems having to do it themselves? Thank you.
I'll start with kind of the first part of your question, and I think I don't have an answer, but we're hoping that, you know, FDA has medical necessary as a definition, and you'll see in the public docket that's released very soon that we'll be asking a question around critical critical drugs, and what does that category look like? How is that defined? Do things pop on and off that depending on what's going on? I think these are all questions that we're asking ourselves internally, and that we'll have to engage stakeholders in this room and elsewhere to get that kind of list, because I do think that varies on specialty and on what your practice is. So I think that it just depends, but I think that's something certainly we're interested in defining and looking at in this task force that we've created at the FDA.
To answer the second part of the question, and I'm sure that this may come up in the next part, our next panel, but we always start with American Society of Health System Pharmacists, in a collaboration with the University of Utah, has some fabulous drug shortage information, documents available, and guidance available. We start there as our first place, as our knowledge center is pulling together information to determine how are we going to prioritize, where are we going to reduce utilization, where are we going to move utilization, how are we going to manage that across 178 hospitals. And then I think the group purchasing organizations play an important role in this. I know from an HCA Health Trust perspective, we take that information and share it across the entire group purchasing organization, which is now around 1,600 facilities. And I'm pretty sure Premier and others are doing that same sort of exercise across their GPO. I think where we struggle, and we work closely with our chief medical officers, is how do we disseminate that information down to the person making the decision on what medication to utilize. So in short of one-off conversations across 178 hospitals, that's where we've really started leaning on the electronic health record and embedding clinical decision support, changing the gentleman from you a second ago mentioned the pains and updating those order sets and changing it. That's absolutely true. But on the back end, if you can change those order sets, guide people to making the right direction, and then give them the information that, hey, this is why we're doing this, because of a shortage. That's been one of the ways that we've tackled it and got to the end user, got to the person that's actually making the prescribing decision.
Hi, Julie Swan, NC State. This question, is directed towards those thinking about the pharmaceutical companies. We've talked some about data sharing and information, and I think it was you, Mary, who made the good point that things are difficult in disasters. I'm more interested in the data sharing that might occur on a regular, ongoing basis. Can you talk from a pharmaceutical perspective about what would be needed to enable sharing about the manufacturing, the supply chain, the production on an ongoing basis?
Sure. So I'll look to Keegan, but not so much by association with the FDA, but acknowledging that, as Doug mentioned this morning, there's a very robust discussion that occurs on a daily basis with most of our companies and the FDA, not so much just about forecasting, but just acknowledging that there's a lot of data that's confidential or otherwise not part of the public domain that is accessible to the decision makers on behalf of not just the federal government, but our overall infrastructure. So I'm not really certain if there's a level of transparency that's different in a disaster versus a routine situation, or just an acknowledgement that it's that open communication that we enjoy as part of those direct relationships that hopefully benefits the overall ecosystem in a disaster.
I concur, and I feel like we had a speaker, somebody that asked a question earlier from industry that talked about the importance of engaging with FDA early on. And I feel like if we have a good understanding of where your capabilities are and what's happening in your space, it's much easier for us to transition or help you should something happen in a disaster-like scenario. So the more information sharing, the better. Some firms are better than others.
James Robinson with the Denver Paramedics. Francois, you mentioned the importance as one of the domains of corporate culture. I found that interesting. And I was wondering from the panel, what do you see the role of leadership in this space being? along those lines of corporate culture? And then what would be the aim of the system that we're trying to build? Is it to completely prevent shortages, or is it to be able to adapt to shortages that we know are going to occur?
Starting from your last point and question, I think it's all of the above. And we try to prevent and alleviate the shortage that exists. When it comes to company culture and corporate culture, it's essential to have a clear and simple message from the top management of the company and consistent message from the management of the company around the priorities and what you make your people accountable for. And that's something we were discovering at the time of the survey and documenting in the drug shortage prevention plan. The companies that's what we found, companies were avoiding shortages or preventing shortages the best were the ones who had a very clear message, clear processes, which means investment in people who are building those processes. It doesn't come for free. You need to dedicate some resources, same as hospitals have dedicated resources to respond to the crisis. You need to dedicate resources to prevent and look proactively at the process. You need to have supply chain leaders, quality leaders, meeting regularly and understanding the potential threats happening in order to address proactively the different elements before they become a crisis, before they become a shortage. Because things are happening every day on the shop floor of the manufacturing or on the quality part. But many of those things are remediated, corrected, improved regularly, and don't end up in a shortage. So it starts from the right tone at the top and management walking the talk of what they say, providing the resources, allocating the right and necessary support, and also making sure the people are accountable for delivering it. If you make your people accountable for evaluating the risks, providing you information regularly, at least once a year on your products, the major brands you are managing, and reporting on your mitigation plans, chances are that a tail of people is working on it, and you will better prevent shortages to happen. So that's in a nutshell how corporate culture is working.
I can jump in to provide a response as well around leadership and corporations and interest and engagement in disaster preparedness and response. So even though right now I work with chain pharmacies, prior to this role for about 3 or so years, I worked at the National Association of County and City Health Officials, working with state and local government, engaging with pharmacies around disaster preparedness and planning. And so I've seen kind of it from two different lenses of how chain pharmacies can engage with the public sector for public health purposes and the good of the community. And I think it starts with leadership, but it also starts with the identification of common missions and common goals to support patients within a community and finding the bridge to engage with folks and the right people to talk to. But once organizations are trying to partner with industry, find that common ground of we both have a similar value and we're trying to get toward an end goal that is common across the company and also the community, that can be a really exciting and powerful catalyst to make real change. And we've seen it happen again and again with companies lining up to participate in these types of preparedness planning and response activities. And my experience is more so of showing the leadership and finding the right contacts at the companies, which sometimes can be very large, but getting to that right person and being able to work through the channels to engage them can be really, really productive. And there's oftentimes a very strong interest to do so. Any other questions for the group?
Good afternoon. Robin Robinson, former BARDA director. You're at a point now in a conundrum. where it's been 20 years since we've been putting together preparedness plans, playbooks, and hashing over this. I remember in 2004 when I joined the federal government out of industry, the first thing in this building was on pandemic influenza, where we put together plans that led to the national strategy for pandemic influenza. My point, though, is related to these public-private partnerships, of which I am a huge proponent, and actually worked on it for 12 years and built, I think, one of the strongest infrastructures of public-private partnerships available in the world. But we're at a point now in which, now that I'm on the other side again, in private industry, of where CEOs, senior vice presidents, and other senior managements are having to balance the altruism that helping others as a mission with shareholder interest of lost opportunities and having faithful public-private partnerships in which there's funding available for continuance of going forward and making sure that infrastructure that was built goes forward. And we've lost some opportunities. Over 5 different major catastrophic events over the last 15 years, we've built that infrastructure. But the point is that the CEOs and senior management are very, very reluctant. I've sat across from them at those tables in private and at WHO, and they say, I don't know if we're going to be able to come back and be able to be part of that next event. If there's another Ebola, if there's another Zika epidemic, I'm not sure we can afford to put in the effort that we did in the past. And there's some alternative concepts that were put in place, 2015, starting 2015, going forward. And those have unfortunately gone dormant. So I would love to hear tomorrow, and if you have comments now, about how we can resurrect those concepts going forward so that we can maintain strong, robust public-private partnerships.
You could absolutely use the task force as a good opportunity to bring those discussions back to the table. I think we'd be more than happy and willing to listen about any ideas that could get us to move forward in this space across the board.
Hi, I'm Matt Rosenberg. I work on the economic staff at the FDA, and I say this, I guess, both as an FDA person and as someone just generally interested in data and modeling. And I pose these questions to the group, maybe as something we continue discussing in the following panels. But, the ideal situation is to not have these shortages happen at all. And, we can do 2 things to address that. We can either try to solve the root problems that drive the decisions. And, as Keegan mentioned, that's something we're working on. The other piece is figuring out how to prioritize the work. Which drugs do we need to get more facilities approved for? Are 5 facilities enough? Do we need 10? I mean, we don't really know what anyone's capacity is or actual volume. And to do that, we need to really have better insight into the supply chain and also the business decisions that are driving, whether firms are going to discontinue products, how profitable certain drugs might be over others. I know some of this is commercial information. It's not something that people want to really share. But, just thinking about building models, how do we figure out which drugs to go after rather than just being reactive to the situation? And to the extent that, either we or others are able to get more data on the big picture of this, industry-wide, that would help us really create the lists that others are talking about, of which drugs, have the most risk of shortage, but also the highest potential impact as well. So I guess I'll just leave you with some of these comments, and if you have anything, feel free to respond. Okay.
No, I feel like everybody was looking at me. So in full disclosure, not only does Pharma work day to day with FDA, we're also looking forward to participating in these listening sessions in an active way around medical shortages and medical product shortages specifically as we look at the overall market piece. So I don't want to conflate this with the disaster-specific conversation, and so a lot of this data and the underpinning conversations are essential in the ecosystem. And so I don't want to say stay tuned, but I will, Matt, say stay tuned, because that's part of the process, I think, is that continuing conversation and the dialogue, because we need the context, we need the backdrop, and we need to have these dialogues that involve all different pieces and the different stakeholders in the supply chain.
And with that, I'd like to join me in a round of applause for our panelists.
I'm going to take chair's prerogative, and Laura's probably going to slap me upside the head because I'm going to talk a bit about a solution, because I heard you, Lou, and I get it. Think about FEMC. Think about the way we tried to address the issue of 15 national threats and prioritize our drug investments, our playbooks, the whole 9 yards, to a targeted set of threats that we wanted to deal with, which goes to Robin's point that there is a template that we used in 04 up through 2010, 2011, 2012. It kind of lost some juice. We not only did it domestically, but we did it internationally through the GSAC. So there is a template for that, and I think FDA's kind of gotten the rose pinned on in terms of dealing with this task group. We're talking here about disasters. ASPR combining with FDA could take on those drugs that are most critically important in disasters, as Lou was sort of talking about, and give those priority consideration and address. It takes some national will, but it takes that enterprise. And you heard me say this morning. An enterprise is a complex and difficult challenge that requires multiple players to get to the solution. Think about putting people on the moon. Engineers, academics, mechanics, you name it, the number of people that were involved in that enterprise was critically important. And where we've had success through BARDA and other entities, it was where we were able to fully bring people to the table and act in a partnering mode. So Keegan, more power to you. I think your ASPR partners, if you wanted to just take out a slice of this and look at those disaster pieces as a place to prioritize and start with, it may be helpful, because the people can relate to that. There's a threat there, we need to fix it. Sorry, Laura, I just, all this is, Lou, you got me going, buddy. What can I tell you? And with Robin as well. At any rate, we're at break time. I'm eating into your break time once again, so thank you for your tolerance, but thank you, panel, for bringing us to this point. It was very good. 15 minutes, back at 3:15.